So with that, I will open it up to any questions or comments from the audience. Thank you all for your attention. Thank you.
And we've got about 10 to 15 minutes for questions, and I will ask Tina to repeat the question just so that it can be captured for the recording, because the acoustics won't do that for us.
Can you go back to your obligatory slide?
Yes, I'm sorry, it's a little embarrassing, but I will. There you go. So it's on the book. There's a discount for the book. Matt Leininger, who's a really great practitioner of all this work, he wrote it. There are a lot of free resources on the website, from slide decks to additional readings to exercises. So there you go. And there's a free online skills module that talks about the kinds of skills people need to do better participation and where you can go for training. So sorry, that's always a little embarrassing. Yes?
You talked about feedback. Can you just elaborate a little bit on what you feel is good feedback?
The question is about feedback and what is good feedback. And do you mean feedback from the decision-making body to the public about the participation?
No, from the public to the decision-making body about the model.
Oh, okay. So how do we think about getting input from the public to government? How do we get good information from them?
And the feedback from the actual, after a participation project.
Yes, and the feedback after the project. So I would say that one of the key things to getting information from the public, is anybody a conflict resolution person in the room? Yes, so you know positions and interests. So much positions are what a person or group wants. It's the demand that they are making. I don't want this development. I do want this bus route. And much of our participation focuses on those things. I would say instead of focusing on positions, which are very black and white and can lead to a lot of conflict, we need to design things where we can get to people's interests. Interests are the things that are motivating those demands. It's the desires, the concerns, the needs, the values. So instead of talking about, I want this bus route, let's talk about, I need a way to get from my house to work in a cost-effective way. I don't want this development. Well, let's talk about the community values and what this community represents in terms of culture and heritage and my family's lineage or whatever. If we can begin to start focusing on interests, we're going to get a lot more valuable feedback from the public. Once we do participation, we often just say, thank you very much, public. Elvis has left the building. And instead what we need to be doing is saying, here are some of the big common themes we heard from the public. Here's how we're taking your information and using it in our decision making. I would also say we need to be upfront about that. If I come to a meeting and I think the government's going to do what I tell them to do and they don't, I will be less than pleased. But if we can say at the beginning of these public events, whether it's online or deliberative or even just a public meeting, we are the International Association for Public Participation has a really nice spectrum that talks about these different levels. So we are going to listen to and acknowledge your feedback. We are going to incorporate your feedback to the extent possible. We are going to collaborate with you through the entire decision-making process, from the development of solutions to the final decision. We are going to empower you and do what you ask us to do. If we can be upfront with people at the beginning and then report back to them how their information was used, that can be incredibly helpful. Yes, in the back.
In Vancouver, you get 5 minutes to speak in front of council.
Wow.
Unfortunately, if you don't speak English, you get 2.5.
Because of translation?
Because of translation. And I'm curious that when you talk about the thick and thin participation, how do you deal with multi-ethnic, multicultural communities, not only in language, but then cultures that don't necessarily see authority or engagement as conflictual, as being different than showing up and speaking in front of a council?
So a great question. So the question is, how do you do engagement, thick engagement, or public meetings when you have people from diverse communities who may not speak the language, who have different cultural traditions around dialogue, around power, around authority? And this is absolutely a huge, huge challenge in participation. And it really speaks to the need to be thoughtful about design before we do it. We can't just take an ad hoc approach to a participation. I think we really need to focus on designing participation. There are a number of ways to address this. So I know actually here, when I was looking at some of the the issues that recently happened around development in Chinatown, that there was simultaneous translation, which can be very effective. And it may or may not work, it may or may not exist. So I've seen processes where materials have been translated into multiple languages, where as part of the effort to get people to the room, one of my favorite examples of this was actually in New York City after the 9/11 incident. World Trade Centers came down, the city wanted to redevelop Ground Zero, and there were a number of issues, from what to do with the towers to a memorial. The whole street grid had been blown away, economic development, housing. And the majority of people who lived in this neighborhood were actually undocumented workers. And so the organizers of this event felt that they had a right to have a voice in what would happen in this community that they lived in. So they went door to door recruiting people, and once they convinced people that they weren't with immigration and customs and they weren't going to get deported, they were able to get people there. So then materials were printed for this event, I think in 16 different languages. There were translators on site to help people. They even had people working in Braille. And this takes a lot of forethought, a lot of effort to get people involved. So there are ways to do this with translation and multilingual services, but it takes a lot of effort. If it becomes too hard to do that, we can also do something, and there's a term for this, and I'm blanking on it, I'm a little embarrassed. But it's basically, I would go to the Chinese community and do a process with the Chinese community all in Chinese. I would go to the Filipino community and do something all in Filipino. I would go to the Iranian community and do something all in Farsi. And then you can bring those pieces together in a way, so that makes it a little bit easier. But this is one of the biggest challenges, especially as our communities really diversify. Yes?
You spoke at the beginning of your talk about the people's trust in public officials dropping, and much of what you've talked about is ways to address that. One of the things that I've heard, and I'm a local government official,
Great.
Is the cynicism that I see in the public when we deal particularly with land use issues, but sometimes big issues. The council has an item on the agenda that by the time the official public input takes place, council is on a path towards a decision that I won't say has been made formally, but the mere fact they've moved it through several readings, it appears to the public that when they attend these meetings, the decision's already been made, and the public meeting is just to satisfy the need for public input.
Vacation, right. Yeah. So this was more of a comment, I think, that a lot of times we'll use participation after a decision has been made or after we're far enough down the road that it's really hard to use public input in a meaningful way. And I think this is absolutely one of the challenges, and one of the reasons people are cynical about government. Don't ask me to come give my opinion on something when a decision has already been made. My time as a citizen is very valuable. And when I come, it just makes me grumpy, makes me distrustful. So if decisions have been made, use strategies where you're informing people about why the decision was made, what the impacts are likely to be. If you need to make a decision immediately, don't do public participation. Right? If my house is on fire, I don't want the fire company deliberating about the best way to get to my house. I want sirens on. I want hoses out. But when we have time to really think about futures in our communities, when we're doing visioning, when we have some more space for decision making, it's better to get the public involved earlier than later. This will help at least begin to address some of those trust issues. And the more we use participation and use it well, the more people are willing to participate. Yes?
I have a comment and then a question. The
Sure.
comment has to do with the point raised back here about dealing with different languages, etc.
Mm-hmm.
In Toronto, there was a major housing project around a place called Regent Park.
Okay.
And that was redeveloped. And there was a lot of well-organized citizen participation to do that. And they solved this problem by combining the language situation with one of your recommendations. They had people sitting around tables, these were residents of the area, of the park itself. And they had them-
I'm going to mic it for just a moment. So the comment is around redevelopment in Regent's Park, where there was a lot of diversity and multiple languages, and to address it, they had people sitting around tables.
And they were organized by ethnicity. So there's a Vietnamese table, the Chinese table, the Italian table, etc.
Okay, and the tables were organized around ethnicities.
And each table had to have at least one person who was bilingual enough to do translation in both directions. Worked beautifully.
That's great. That's great. So you could have people sit around tables where they all speak the same language and have at least one person who could translate for others to understand.
Now, my question is this. You've alluded to it a few times, and people who concern themselves with kind of the political theory side of all of this see a cultural dimension, which is an inhibition to effective participation. And that cultural dimension is the prevalence of what the Canadian theorist C.B. Macpherson called possessive individualism. Selfishness, self-centeredness, and a fixation on property and so on.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Macpherson opined from his study, so he didn't have to get his hands dirty on this, opined that citizen participation, that this was a downward spiral that could be made as an upward spiral by means of citizen participation. That effective citizen participation, though impeded by a culture of possessive individualism, could also be combated by it. I would dearly like to believe that that is true, and I'm wondering if you know. I mean, you've actually engaged in all of these forums. Is it right? Is he right?
So the question is that some political theorists have noted that there's something called possessive individualism, where people are really concerned about their own self-interest and less concerned about public interests, and that citizen participation might have helped combat that to make people more public-oriented. And the question is, I want that to be true. Is that true? And I would say, it depends. Right? It depends. I can show you case after case after case after case of public participation gone wrong, where people became less tolerant, where people became angrier, less trusting, less efficacious, more concerned about their self-interests. But I can also show you case after case after case where people became more public-oriented, more interested in the public, more tolerant, more engaged, more efficacious. And for me, the answer is about how we design these processes. So when participation is done well, when people feel like they have a voice and their voice matters, when they are treated with empathy, courtesy, and respect, they're given recognition, people tend, not everybody, but most people tend to become more open, more tolerant, more politically efficacious, more willing to engage in public issues. In 2000, I think it was 8, it might have been 10, shortly after the big financial crisis, U.S. was having terrible problems with federal budget, couldn't get anything passed. And there was a big effort to bring 3,500 Americans from across the country of all political persuasions together because our Congress couldn't figure out what to do with the budget. And these 3,500 citizens worked really hard, listened to each other, and they came to consensus on some very reasonable measures where wealthy people were willing to pay more taxes. Less wealthy people were willing to see some service cuts, and regardless of how far left or how far right people were on the political spectrum, they came together and solved a problem, which I always, just want to say, here, Congress, take this. So we have case after case where we can show you that when participation is designed well, when people are given opportunities to discuss, they understand the issues, they can really kind of overcome those self-interests and think more broadly about public interests. Doesn't always work, and not for everybody, but it certainly can. One more. Anthony, you have to pick.
No.
I'll go here. Yeah. Sorry. Oh. Sorry. Well, maybe I'll do 2. We'll go here, and then we'll go here. Quick questions.
I sit on the City of Vancouver's Children's and Family Advisory Committee, and
Great.
we work a lot with staff. I was wondering, you suggested that staff members and that city officials should make information accessible. How would you, what suggestions would you have for staff to make information accessible to young people? And our youngest member is 10.
Oh, cool.
And our older members are required. So we have a large spectrum of individuals representing different interests.
Yeah.
And so what would your suggestions be in terms of that?
Great question. So how do we make information accessible to a broad spectrum of people in our community, from really young kids to older people? I think that the way we present information depends on the complexity of things. There are all sorts of tools and techniques out there, from infographics. When I try to get information, I always go to the School of Public Communications and our PR kids, and I make them do stuff for me because they're way better at it. And they design these really cool infographics that can break things down. To simple presentations and YouTube videos. I mean, I think we need to get creative and think about how we convey this information. The more complex the issue, the more challenging, but it absolutely can be done. And if you connect with me afterwards, I can give you some websites and tools for this. Christine, I'm sorry, I'm totally overriding Anthony and going with Christine for the last question.
Just a quick one about participation design and burnout, because
Yes.
it's such a huge issue, and I wonder if you have any specific comments on that, on
Yeah.
how to combat or cope with.
So the question is about participation design and burnout. Whose burnout are you talking about? The officials or the public's?
The public's.
Yeah.
Yeah, we see the same faces again and again and again on
Right.
the different committees. And
Well, so I love thinking about participation design. This is one of my super nerdy delights. And I think one of the biggest questions, in fact, the most challenging question, is who do we want and how do we get them there? Right? The question of who the right people are is the toughest one in participation. And the way we do participation traditionally gets us the usual suspects. In the United States, I'm imagining the same is true in Canada, but in the United States that means rich, wealthy, retired white people, right? Because they're the ones with the time and the resources to participate. So there are a couple of ways we can think about recruitment for this. One is that voluntary self-selection. We put out a flyer, whoever shows up, shows up. That typically gets us the usual suspects. It's fine for low-stakes, non-controversial issues. But we need to overcome participation bias, and I'll talk about the burnout too. The bias, which means that the people who are in the room don't look like the community at large. And a couple of ways to do this are through proactive network recruitment, building connections, building the trust with our community organizations and having them help us to recruit. Random selection. If you do stats at all, you know that randomly selecting can overcome all of these biases. And then creating incentives for people to come. In the US, in my community particularly, people don't come because there are transportation limits. Right? We have a terrible public transportation system. They'd have to have child care or elder care. Sometimes, so providing incentives to help overcome those issues. Providing food is a really good way to help get people into the room. So there are all sorts of recruitment techniques. And I would also just say that if you're with the...
I'm with the City of Vancouver's Women's Advisory Committee.
Okay, so the Women's Advisory Committee. You should be connecting with the Planning Commission, and the Planning Commission should be connecting with school boards, and the school board should be connecting with your children and advisory group. And all of these, if we think about networking our different parts of government together so that they can help network with the community. Let's stop reinventing the wheel. It's so exhausting, right? Let's all work together, get over your turf wars. I mean that totally respectfully, and really start collaborating because, again, children and youth issues don't get solved without dealing with women's issues, and they don't get solved without dealing with education, and those don't get solved without dealing with hunger and access to food and food deserts, and that doesn't get solved without dealing with planning, right? So we need to start connecting all of these pieces so that we're tearing down our silos and really thinking about our community as a whole. And that way you're reaching out to more people, and the participants don't become as burnt out. And when participation becomes better, the staff who are doing it are less likely to get burnt out. Because right now, I think that Vancouver and Seattle are far more advanced, as we heard earlier, than most communities. But still, it's an exhausting endeavor. So thank you all for being here and coming. I look forward to talking with you more at the break. I'll turn it over to Anthony.
Thank you. Thanks, Tina. I think that the greatest test of any public presentation is the participation that follows it. And we have seen an A-plus discussion and dialogue to get our workshop started today. Thanks to Professor Nabatchi for coming and joining us. And we have a little memento for you of your visit. And now we will take a break till 11 a.m. where you can have more dialogue with her and one another, and then we'll reconvene. Thank you.